Good afternoon, everyone in Hong Kong, and good morning to everyone in Europe and specifically in the UK. Today, or at this moment, I would like to introduce the sixth and final keynote for IASDR 2021 before tomorrow we kick off the Graduate Consortium Day. It is important that after conclusion of the keynote that I've been asked by our technical team for everyone to just stay seated, because we actually want to do a quick wrap-up of the last 3 days and all the activities. Now, today's speaker, for some of us, or for most of us, need no introduction here in the School of Design at Hong Kong PolyU, but for the sake of our international audience, it is Professor Anne Boddington, Professor Emerita of Design Innovation at Kingston University. Good morning, Anne.
Good morning.
Ha, there you are. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good morning, Hong Kong. Good afternoon, Hong Kong, I should say. Very nice to be in PolyU, albeit virtually, and I miss you all very much.
Okay, thank you for joining us. For the rest of us, the introduction that I would like to use to set the tone for today's or the last keynote, Anne gave me very clear instructions not to overdo it, but to keep it short. I'll try, Anne, and if I get it wrong, we can talk about it later. Professor Anne Boddington is Professor Emerita of Design Innovation at Kingston University. She's educated as an architect, an urbanist, a cultural geographer, with over 35 years of experience in higher education. She also has 20 years in senior leadership positions, of which the last one was Pro Vice Chancellor of Research, Business and Innovation at Kingston University. She is fundamentally a curious educator, teacher, and researcher. Her experience includes strategic and organizational design, business planning and finance, quality assurance in teaching and research, and then also added to that career development. She has worked with the UK government's Quality Assurance Agency and Higher Education Academy. She also internationally supports other institutions, for example, the Foundation for Science and Technology in Portugal and other European nations, Estonia, Iceland, Austria, and Germany, amongst others. She is currently chair of the UK's £30 million National Interdisciplinary Circular Economy Research Programme Advisory Board. And then I think what is very important to mention in this context today, chair of the Research Excellence Framework, or the REF 2021, for sub-panel for Arts and Design, History, Practice and Theory. She has also done this in previous rounds of exercises for the UK. For us in PolyU, we know her quite well because Anne was instrumental in our last RAE exercise. And this is, I think, also what motivated us to invite her back to talk to us about, well, not only to us, but the whole community, about design and research impact. Anne, thank you very much. The floor is yours, and I hope that we can have wonderful discussion about the question of impact, because already in some of the previous keynotes that was touch points in each of the discussions. Thank you.
Genuinely really lovely to be here, albeit virtually. And as I say, I very much miss Hong Kong, and thank you so much for inviting me back. I hope there's a few, I know there's a few people in the audience that I've worked with over the years. And a big thank you, and I must echo Rachel's comment yesterday, for all the help. Shanna has been amazing in guiding people like me through this process. So thank you. As I say, good morning, Europe. Good evening if you're in Los Angeles. So without further ado, I'm going to try and do the screen sharing. Okay. So here we go. I think you've got to listen to me for something like an hour, and I will try and get through it in that time, and hope we've got some questions at the end of it. So, design research, impact and integrity. I'm going to talk about two things which really sit and are often quite invisible in research, and we don't often mention. And I think particularly now, and as we go forward, we've got some quite big challenges to take on, and impact and integrity are two of the things which form, if you like, the invisible nest around the edge of design research. So I have structured this talk really around cooking, which might seem strange. I'm going to talk very much about donuts, or cycles, circles and donuts, and I hope it will all make sense, or come to make sense as I go through this. And really the first thing is to talk about this as a work in progress. Impact is relatively new anyway, but this is a work in progress for me too. So I'm sharing this quite raw. I think we have an opportunity post-COVID, or not even post-COVID at the moment. We have a new variant raging in the UK. But it is a chance, and we've heard about the big reset. We've heard about rethinking, remaking, and that alongside things like climate emergency and prosperity without growth. All, I think, challenge our humanity in different ways. The only thing I'm going to say, which is about me probably, is what I'm interested in and what I care about. And that is increasingly about craft. And that's craft not in the sense of only making, but in terms of the craft of the things we do, and even the craft indeed of thinking. Cooking, because I think it's a social exercise, as is eating. It's a really important thing to kind of think about research in a kind of sense of sharing knowledge. Education I've cared about all my life, and I think it's not taken seriously enough in some ways, and I'll come back to that later. Design research, because that's where I come from as a discipline. And I think more importantly than ever, COVID has taught us all something which is around duty of care. And I'll come back to that several times over during this talk. And I think it's a Bruno Latour quote, which is, yes, we have to think differently, to quote Rachel yesterday, and I think we have to change. But in that change, I think we have to be radically careful, and indeed carefully radical. So I think that's enough about me. I'm going to also share some definitions, because I think I believe in definitions, and I believe that they give us some parameters, which a lot of this conversation will be about, I hope, today. And maybe it's because I'm getting older, but I think we have to think about what design does. And it doesn't do everything. And quite often we get into a conversation where design does everything and can do everything. And Rachel said it yesterday, and I will say it and reinforce it today, is that we won't save the world on our own. What design does is to shape the why of many things. For me, research is very clear. It is the investigation of knowledge in a field. And scholarship, by the way, is the investigation of knowledge in a person. Just to put those two in context, design research, therefore, is the investigation of the critical parameters that give us meaning and indeed form to ideas. And innovation for me is the realization of ideas. So the reason I'm laying those out is that I think it impacts on the way that we then talk about other things. And I also want to just talk for a few minutes just about the references I'm going to at least present today. And Gerhard mentioned it earlier, really how things like the grey literatures of research assessment exercise in Hong Kong, or the research excellence framework in the UK, actually begin to impact on our behaviours at the edges. And sometimes we get so wrapped up in our projects that we don't really think about the things that are influencing us. And over the last decade, one of the things that's influenced me hugely, or at least my thinking around these things, is the trilogy that Richard Sennett completed now a couple of years ago, so which is The Craftsman, Together, and Building and Dwelling Ethics for the City. And the reason those things are important is, one, that Sennett, I think, gives a very clear sense of the dignity of good work and the embodiment of iteration, which we all kind of know, but what I think he does really well is to present it in an expanded form, such that we can really treasure quality. And I'll come back to that several times over. Probably the most pertinent and possibly the book that is less known is the book called Together. And I think this gets to the heart of many of the things we do, which is around the, if you like, the craft of cooperation. Cooperation, as he puts it, is more than goodwill. It requires the extraordinary amount of skill to live in a racially, ethically, religiously, or economically different context. And as we become, and as we have become more global, in a sense, we've lost some of the ability to do that. And the last book really is a sort of summing up of many of those things in terms of the choreography of the open city, where inhabitants and dwellers learn to accommodate that kind of complexity that he talks about in Together. And I think those three things give us a really fantastic basis and a very good scholarly basis for that. The next one, which is really one of, again, it builds on the premise of Together, which is Michael Sandel's very, very incisive critique of something we all accept in universities far too easily, which is the tyranny of meritocracy. And really the question that says, I do all of this alone. And he shifts something which we all talk about in universities all the time, the equality of opportunity, to talk about an equality of condition. And that, for me, is a really important concept, which is that whether we are a professor or whether we are the technician or the research assistant in the context of design, of a design research project, we all matter, and we forget that we all matter. And COVID reminded us of that, and that we never do anything entirely alone. And the meritocratic model has for too long, I think, overtaken that kind of sense that there are people at the top of that tree and there are people that are lower down that ladder. And I don't think that we can any longer accept that. And one of my most refreshing references, and I'll come, and this was an absolute joy, and I read this actually during lockdown, which was even more of a joy, which was Vaganti's Overcrowded. And one of the things that he takes on absolutely centrally, and which I cheered when I listened to it, which was that he takes on some of the IDEO challenges of problem solving, of design thinking, and says, well, yeah, that's all very well, but actually, what about the designer? And I will come back to this several times, as I say, in the next hour, which is really, when we talk about user-centered design or user-centered innovation, where is the designer in that? And have we done enough self-reflection in that context to bring user-centered design to the table, or are we only facilitators? I don't believe we are. I think we have a very important role to play, but we have to bring those two things together. And Vaganti takes that right at the core of his argument. And I think that's something to think back again. And he doesn't evade user-centered design. He just puts it in a sense in its place, and it is not a mantra for everything, despite the fact that we should always co-design. It's how we do that, and indeed when we do that. Goodhart's book similarly, and the reason I've brought this in is, as an educator, this was a really interesting text for me, which is the Design Council in the UK, of which I am a trustee and deputy chair of its board of trustees, often talks about bringing together head, heart and hand, and that's Goodhart's argument, similarly to that of Sandel and others, which is an argument about social justice and the redistribution of status and dignity across the structure. The interesting thing for me, which is not something Goodhart says, but which I took from it, is that if we talk about education and we talk about the cognitive, affective and psychomotor pyramids of knowledge, they echo the head, heart and hand, and that's in a way where it comes from. And I think it's really interesting to bring that educational piece to the table. And the last one, which is really where my donut analogy comes from, is, and this is relatively new for me, and Rachel mentioned it at the end of her talk yesterday, which is Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. And it is a book which actually really fundamentally challenges the idea of growth. And I mentioned at the beginning, prosperity without growth. And the argument here, and I think it's a really important one for designers, is we have finite resources, and the planet is a finite entity. And what she's talking about is that growth, GDP growth, as we talk about it in the kind of free world economic model, is a curious thing to think about, because most things that grow actually do also die, and that is part of the cycle of life. So how do we think through that as designers? And I want to take up the challenge that she presents in her book, which is to try and draw that, or to realize that in this talk a little bit. And the last one, which is slightly mischievous, as a reference, is Ruined by Design, which, as I say, Rachel also in a sense referred to yesterday when she said designers have done as much damage as they have good. And we often don't think about that. And design is, we present ourselves quite often as designers as world saviors. We've done a lot of damage too. And I think we have to start thinking about how we think through, indeed, the impact of our actions, and that we take responsibility for those. So those are the references, and these are the things that they're not design books for the most part. They're actually books that sit outside of that. And the last thing, because it does shape us, which is that sort of sense of the invisible nest in which we all practice. And whether we're designers, whether we're researchers, or whether we're educators, that what is often called grey literature, the policies and requirements, are the things that sit around the edge, but they have far more influence than we often recognise. So why impact? And I'm going to just talk through impact and then integrity. And impact, and here are 3 definitions. The RAE one from Hong Kong, and it was only brought in for the first time in the last exercise. We are now going through our 2nd research excellence framework that talks about impact. And indeed, Australia, having wobbled a little bit around impact, then took it on and used very similar definitions. But the ref one, which is the one I'm working with at the moment, is an effect on, change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment, quality of life beyond academia. And probably the most important thing in there is the first bit and the last bit of that sentence, the effect on, change or benefit and beyond academia. And those things are really critical to the way we do it. But fundamentally, why impact? Because most designers will say they want to make a difference. And one of the things that's fantastic about impact is that it is about making a difference, and it's about evidencing that very difference. And why integrity? And research integrity is a relatively, in its current form anyway, is relatively new, but it affects so much of what we do. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. But conducting research such that it is trusted, and that the methods and findings are trusted not only by other academics, but by the public, particularly if we draw on public funds. But the other thing it refers to, and I think this is something that we often don't have a conversation about enough, it refers to not only the conducted research, but to the professional integrity of researchers. So how we behave, not only amongst our immediate colleagues, but how we behave as researchers in that context. So it's very much about how research is conducted, but also, and this is where it really affects design schools or universities around the world, it's about the cultures, conditions and career support that shape the research environment. And that is so important to us taking design research and all research actually to the next level, I think. And we have some challenges to make. And as designers, I think we should be able to design that environment such that we can take some of those things out. So I'm going to first go through some issues around impact and where I think it can actually galvanize and bring together research. And then I will talk about research integrity. So this is my definition of impact. And this goes really beyond research impact, which is the difference we make and the evidence for the difference we make. And I think that's very, it sounds very simple. And why is it helpful to design research is the kind of question. What we are often trained to do as researchers is disseminate or broadcast. Or to do activities, but none of those tell us whether we ever made a difference. All they do is broadcast. They do what we do and what TV does and what radio does. They broadcast to a public. We don't know whether they're read. We don't know whether they made any difference to anything other than the odd citation index that we use, not so much in design research, but in research more generally. But I think the really fantastic thing about impact is, and I'll try and explain this a bit more, it really starts to aid how we shape and plan in the direction we take. It gives us some momentum, gives us some purpose, it gives us meaning about where we want to make that difference. And the other thing that is really clear very early on is that it starts to stimulate questions around collaboration and around partnerships that are not transactional. They're partnerships that are enduring, that we work and evolve over time. So it is about fundamentally human relationships that we form and foster as we go through a research process. And of course, because of that, if we decide we want to affect policy or the environment, that we can start to shape the methods and methodologies or the methodology we put together. And I think in that sense, it plays a role in creating that sort of virtuous cycle that coheres a practice of design. And the two questions that really underpin that is, in a lot of the work that I've done, both in teaching and in research, one of the questions that's often asked is you know, when I go into a different institution, you ask, well, what's the relationship between teaching research and all the other and design practice, or any of those sorts of questions? And one of the, well, most people say, well, I teach my research. It's about content fundamentally. And I think the really interesting thing for me around all of this is that actually impact for me was the missing link. When you start to bring impact in, i.e. the difference we make, what's the difference we make to teaching and research and knowledge exchange, we start to engage all of those things and they start to draw together through a common idea of making a difference. And we all say we want to do it, but we all tend to do it kind of in various individual ways rather than looking at impact as a collective endeavor. And I think that sense that it reconnects in different ways the way we teach, and that rather than teaching being seen as a transaction, it's actually something where students and teachers work rather differently together. And the hierarchy of that is changed in that context. Similarly, how teaching and public life come together. How does what we teach and the students that we work with actually work in the civic or public environment? And I know from my experiences of PolyU, that was something that really touched me when I came to PolyU about the way that some of those things had started to evolve. But I think to make it really clear, we need to think about impact in those terms. And that puts us into, as I say, a very different relationship with our students. As I say, it changes that sense that we're all agents of change, and maybe that is the collective mission that brings us together. But it also means that the design community has a role to play in terms of a civic contributor, an economic contributor, and it forces us actually to think about methods of how we evidence that. Because one of the challenges for design, and I noticed Rachel mentioned it yesterday too, is that we don't have the skills often to make our case. So we talk about the broadcast rather than the impact, and bringing impact to bear and really seeing teaching, research and knowledge exchange as the kind of three pillars that sit underneath that, and impact as the, if you like, direction and purpose, we start to really begin to see how those things come together. And so what we do in that sense is to build that value of design research and through the creation of evidence. And that's the really beautiful thing about bringing those things together, and how practitioners and professional designers, how our students all become agents in a sense in making that difference collectively in terms of our research, and celebrating that we don't all have the same strengths. We're not all researchers, and research isn't the sort of elite end of academia. It is one part of academia, and teaching, knowledge exchange and our civic responsibility as educators is really played out in that, and we recognize and reward, I might add, those different strengths. And I think that is vital, and working on our ability to bring together working skills that actually maximize that impact or maximize that difference we make. And I hope what that should do, and I can see all sorts of ways that we could do this, is to stimulate new kinds of links and less hierarchies between teaching, research, knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer, and indeed design practice. So those relationships become much more of a network than they do individual bilateral relationships. And I think in that, what we start to do is build a kind of strategic net beyond the academy. So the academy is part of that net and not separate from it, which is often where we're articulated by members of government and others. But I think, you know, Hong Kong PolyU is a great example of that, and there are many around the world. But I think designing and developing new measures and data sets to capture impact is one of the challenges, which I'll come on to. The other lovely thing, and I will reinforce this, is impact is about the effect, affect, change, and or benefit. But the most important thing is it's about what you achieve and produce together. It is not about who you are. It is not about the title you hold. It is about the collective effort and the evidence of production. And I think that is so, it's a leveling part of impact, which I think is in this sort of post-COVID or restructure really important. Impact, the challenging bits, there are a number, and one of them is how we then develop methods and methodologies that not only stop research at the point of broadcast or of dissemination, as it's generally called, but actually start to think about, right at the beginning of research, how we gather qualitative and quantitative evidence and understand impact not as a transaction, and I'll show an example of this in a minute, but as a cycle, as part of the cycle of what we do. We make a difference, we do more research, we make more difference. And it's that kind of sense that how we test those things is actually part of our bigger joined up infrastructure. And the other thing, and that's to all of those of you out there who are leading design schools or universities or parts of universities, is how we integrate impact into those existing cultures and structures. And that's about reward, recognition, benefit for careers. And I think that's a really key element, is that it's not a bureaucracy. It is actually a really, really important part of our social mission as higher education. And I think providing the evidence for transformation is one of the hardest things. And this is what both the RAE in Hong Kong, but also the REF in the UK has been working on. And one of the key interesting things about that is not data actually, it's how do you capture the voice of a user? How do you really hear those? There's nothing more powerful than when somebody else describes the impact of what you've done, both in breadth or in depth, the profound nature of the difference that has been made. So I think it's really critical then to identify the type of impact we want to make. Where do we want to make a difference? Is it industrial? Is it about policy or health or culture? And then to distinguish impact from broadcasting, just shouting louder at the top of one's voice about research, whether that's on social media or indeed in conferences, but also distinguish it from activity. Activity may lead to impact, but activity is what it says. It is an engagement with the research, but that activity may or may not make any difference to any of those people. It may put them all off, so we really don't know. And from esteem, you know, that sense that I'm very important. And I think we have to get over that very important and say, what's the evidence that you've made a difference? And that's really why impact is so critical. And the significance, the depth, the profound nature of that, and its reach, which may be quick, global, and not very deep, or it may be life-changing for a community very local to you. And I think those things both are vital. And I did ask before I showed this, but I want to share one impact example with you, which is just to really play this out. And I asked Peter Hasdall, who's at PolyU, Associate Professor at PolyU, if I could share this with you. The point I want to make though here, and this is the point that impact isn't always planned. And this was a project that I was working through with Peter actually in terms of his own research. And we were looking then at what difference it had made. And it was a project that started really to build with social scientists, so in partnership with social scientists, or in mainland China, a community kitchen and a social enterprise. And, you know, it was done with all the right intentions for research, but it wasn't necessarily planned in the sense that we'd specifically said, okay, what difference are we going to make in this project, or what difference might we make? So it was done as a research project with all the right intentions, but without the measures or structures around it. So we'd spent a long time working through what those measures needed to be, and then having to reboot or revisit to find them. And the really extraordinary thing when I asked Peter whether I could share it was he sent me some more information. And the really extraordinary thing was to receive the information about the next projects and realize that the learning that had come from doing the impact study rather than the research necessarily was actually that the impact became much, much clearer. And so you know, there are now 11 projects, 12 villages and 8 provinces. So it's really started to work through that. But what was extraordinary was to see new projects that had come out of that in different regions where it was incredibly clear what the impact had been. And that sense of iteration between doing the research, learning from it, making that difference, hearing that, and that loop became the richness. So it didn't start there, but we have to recognize impact, and we have to then find the means and indeed the structures to support it. And you can see the absolute transformation in the way that those things are presented, and the power of design research actually to make a significant difference. So it was really extraordinary to see it, but it was also very powerful to see how it had evolved over time. So the second area which I want to touch on, and I think is equally the case, and it ties very closely into this, which is research integrity, which is about how research is conducted. And its purpose is really to, as you say, bring trust and confidence to the methods we use in any research, but design research in this context. But it's also about the culture and professional integrity of researchers. And I'm sure there's nobody that would argue with this, that research is about honesty, originality, accuracy, rigor, and transparency in the way that we conduct it. And our motives for doing it: contributing to culture and society, fulfilling our own creativity and curiosity, and indeed enhance the knowledge, our knowledge and that of others. And the characteristics of in research integrity are about multi or interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary work. They're about openness, collaboration, creativity. Most people wouldn't argue with any of that, nor would I. But it's incredibly difficult to achieve. And the question kind of is behind that is, what is it in our policies and structures and practices that work against us achieving this? And this is very much a UK work in progress, which is why I'm sharing it, but it is moving around the world, and I think is critical, which is about the concept really of psychological safety. And what this is about in any context, and you could use a research group or a design school or any group of people working together, is to develop psychological safety in the team members. And this is where we start to touch on how difficult this can be, given some of the policies and structures that we experience. And one of that is, can we disagree constructively without fear of recrimination? And we've seen a world that's been increasingly damaged by that. We've only got to look at the politics of the recent past to see those really, really difficult disagreements kind of playing out in the world. But we can't do that within a research community too. We have to think about how we are not, seen as difficult because we disagree in a constructive way. So how do we then make sure that people can seek and provide critical and honest feedback without feeling damaged by that? And it comes back to collaborating effectively and experimenting and taking risk without that sense of fear, without a fear of recrimination, of admitting mistakes and errors. We should, if a research project doesn't work, we should publish the fact that it doesn't work, because then nobody else spends money on it. It's very simple in that sense, but we tend to only want to publish success, and we've got to be really careful about that as in terms of it being a good research environment. And the other thing, of course, is to be able to, anybody should be able to ask for help at any level in that context. And all of these things are really challenging when you're trying to create a psychologically safe environment. And they provide, they colour the way research appears. And I think that's something we really need to reflect on as a design community, and design psychological safety, or design out the behaviours that do that. And that requires us to look very hard at the skills, knowledge and competencies around interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity, and whether we're really listening, whether we are really biased. We all are. So how do we escape the echo chambers? And it's why for many years I've always wanted to read outside of the bubble, in a sense, and test the waters. And collaboration, and I've mentioned it several times, is about recognizing our self-limits, but also understanding new languages and learning how to tackle those. And creativity, which is a kind of often a given, but actually we have to work out what it is. And for me, Ai Weiwei's kind of definition of the power to act is the best definition of creativity, is one that I am using and referring to here. And one of the things that challenges it, and this really to give examples, but one of the challenges is that far too much of our institutional life is driven by institutional measures that land on an individual's desk. And that's what I mean by colander management. You know, you pour a policy in at the top, and the Vice Chancellor hands it to the Pro-Vice Chancellor, the Pro-Vice Chancellor hands it to the Dean, and the Dean hands it to the heads of school, and the heads of school hand it to the individuals. And what you've got is a piece of policy landing on your desk with no measures or processes that take responsibility, that share that responsibility through the institution, which is what institutions are for. They are to distribute that kind of sense of responsibility so that collectively we reach a goal. And I think that sense of being able to do that and thinking about the external systems and whether they actually lead to bureaucracies or that we use proxies that are inappropriate. And the one I will use, because it's a very obvious one, is that money does not equal quality. And often, you know, the question at an interview for research or the quality of something is measured by the amount of money it has raised. Money is only about government initiatives. It's only about what's fashionable. And if you don't do fashionable research, you probably won't find money to do it. And the reason to come back to impact is that by being clear about the difference we make, we are much more likely to be able to play in that space in powerful, really powerful ways. And quite often, because of all of those things, we end up with lots of things like the ref and like audits and like quality assurance being the enemy of research and indeed teaching, rather than saying actually all of those things are designed as nudges to a better practice. How do we practice better such that those things don't get in the way and become a box ticking exercise? I mean, my experience with PolyU and my experience with working with colleagues, with students, with doctoral students, is that by explaining how and what those things are trying to do, we will achieve a psychological safety that is incredibly powerful in terms of our communities. So for me, those things are so critical and often so silent in the communities that we work in. And I mention these partly because I'm at least virtually in Hong Kong, which is that there have been, and I would urge everybody to sign up to them, there have been a set of principles which are known as the Hong Kong Principles for Research Integrity, published at least in draft form, and they're still in negotiation, which are about how to develop research integrity within our communities. And particularly around career advancement, about the stages and the sorts of things that we need to think about. And they do, for example, recognize that actually there is a huge breadth and a range of research activities to which other people contribute, and we have to recognize those people. It is important that we do peer review well, that we mentor colleagues, peer-to-peer, you know, and you know, senior to junior staff. All of those things are really, really vital in a research ecosystem, and that's a really vital element. So those are a few bits of food for thought. We might want to talk about that afterwards. Now to donuts, which is always a good, at least for me, because I'm in the morning, is to take on Kate Raworth's challenge. In her book on donut economics, she talks about picking up the pencil and drawing our parameters. And really, to return to, you know, whether it's Don Norman's "we have to change" kind of message or Rachel's "we've got to think differently." I wouldn't disagree with either of those, but I think the question is how we do that and how we find ways to visualize, because designers like to do that too, and understand the limits of our own practice. And so I guess what I'm talking about is a donut for design in that context. And one of the things about the donut is what's in the middle are the things we have to tackle. The social foundation is our baseline, if you like. It's what we see as the very baseline for human existence. We have a safe space for humanity, which is the donut. And we have a point at which our our resources are finite, and that ecological ceiling is precisely that. And we need to work from within the donut to bring critical human deprivation, in the case of this slide, or any planetary degradation on the outside of the diagram into that space. And that is our key principle. And as I say, as a trustee of the Design Council, we've been working through some of these things through the frameworks that we produce. And in 2019, we produced the Framework for Innovation, which takes the double diamond and really expands that to explore how we might apply that, one to ourselves, but also to other entities, be they businesses, academic institutions or others. How do you innovate in that context? And more recently, and only in, and some of you may have seen this, the next framework we produced was the Systemic Design Framework, which was actually only released in April of this year, and really just talks about the principles of systemic design, that idea that we think in a systems way about systemic design, and what are all the things we need to think about in that. So these are the principles of people and planet-centered, circular and regenerative, that sense of zooming from the individual to the collective and back again, and collaborating and connecting. One of the things I really liked about this framework, and possibly my favorite piece in it, is that what it recognizes is that we need many different skills, and we should be clearer in ourselves, really, and as a community, what kind of designer or design researcher we are. And there are, in the systemic framework, there are sort of characters, and these are characteristics of the different kinds of people we are. Some people are naturally systems thinkers. Some people make in order to explore the, design and innovation through the production, through the embodied experience. And some are great on a public stage, and they can talk and tell great stories, or indeed bring people together. And I think that starts to give us some real clues about really shifts in the way we might educate, which are not about the subject so much as about the skills and knowledge that we produce. And then to put the double diamond into a context, it is really to show it and rethink some of the kind of parameters of the double diamond, and then how it expands. And of course, the diagram on the right really shows us that you can't, with a system, you don't do something once, you iterate and do it again and again in order to move the system and the form of that system. So to come to design in that context, and why I think the donut is quite useful, is it starts to help us think about our own parameters. And that might be individually, it may be in a research group, it may be in a school, or it may be in a wider community of practice. And if design gives meaning and form to those ideas, then the donut, I think, is a really helpfully constraining form, which clearly can delineate some of the craft of design, the skills of collaboration, and particularly, as I say, the rigors of constraint. And within that, and I know Rachel talked about our values yesterday, but it's how we think about those values to give us constraint. And I think the donut starts to do that, both as an individual in a global context. And that's always very hard to see when we're deeply buried inside a project. So I think it allows us to be both self-reflective as designers, but also to bring the social and collaborative dimensions of learning and research together. And it then challenges our purpose. So I had a go, and I'm only sharing these because they are very, I'm not a graphic designer, as you can very much tell, but I think it's really interesting to think about, okay, well, so what's beyond our capacity, and how do we work on the projects that are about the overshoot and the projects that are about shortfall in terms of our design challenges? What are our social foundations in terms of whether it's Design for Planet, which is the Design Council's sort of rather newer line in the UK, Design for Justice, which is another one, or for social justice, many people would say. So what's beyond our capacity? What won't we do? And how do we work out what those values are? And I think that kind of sense of, yes, if we're going to think differently, how and what are the tools that we use to do that? And impact, likewise, impact is cyclic. And as I said, you might do something as a designer only to work out what, and make a difference, only to work out what the research question is after you've done it. And in a sense, the project I showed that Peter Hasrell did was a real iteration of research. And then, so what differences did we make to the economics of these people? How do we then iterate that back into the research to enrich in the research to make more difference? And it becomes that virtuous cycle that I'm referring to. And design practitioners, design teachers, and students can all be a part of that in a very enriching way, such that we don't make research an elite practice that teaching gets in the way of, and that these two things come very tightly together. So I think it starts to help us think about that, and how, you know, wherever we want to make a difference, whether it's in community, in culture, in health and well-being, in our professions, we actually understand how design works to do that, and how it can both feed back and feed forward into that cycle. And lastly, because I want to come back to it, is to think about the way we work together. And this, I think, is where we've got to be very careful about the meritocratic argument and question that as designers, and start to shape the environment that we want to work in, the way we want to practice as professionals, as educators, and as researchers. We have to challenge publish and perish. Quality matters. Quality, one great paper from you know, millions of pounds of research would be much better than 10. And we still value the 10 quite often rather than the 1. And I really do challenge publish or perish. And as somebody chairing a research excellence framework, we have lots and lots of money. But you look at the other end of that, which actually research councils often don't, and say, was the quality there? And we can't always say yes to that. So we've got to think very carefully about, do we know what quality looks like for us, and how do we deal with it? So money is not a proxy for quality, and that brings publish and perish and proxies for quality together. And I think we have to think about the criteria for success. And I know all of the issues around that from a league table perspective and other things, but actually, so we have to challenge the way that the league tables are made up. And that's a job for many vice chancellors around the world. So we have to think through all of those things as we do that. Because in the end, people do research, and that is absolutely fundamental. It is a human to human relationship, and one that we really have to focus on in that context. And nothing in the world will take that away. It will be a people to people relationship and a community to community relationship. And lastly, and this is really just to summarize, we are a community. We say we are a community, and we need to behave like one. And that is to all of those kind of questions. And we have, as designers, perhaps more responsibility, one, to challenge those parameters, but also to design them and to consider how they work, how to advance research, transform education, and make a difference. We are the systems we create and work within. And I can't stress that enough. Quite often it's as if we are done to. We can't be done to in this situation. We have to be active participants in that context. And we have to then recognize what the distinctive qualities of individuals are, and they will all be different You know, I may not be the best researcher, but I may be able to facilitate other people's research in such ways that they can become better. And I am quite happy to be the facilitator and recognize that actually I have a role in that bigger sense of community, and I don't have to be at the top of some pyramid, and I don't have to have a title. It's really about how we work together, and that we recognize those sorts of things, and that we challenge the parameters and measures that frustrate a quality research environment. Many students, many faculty around the world will say, I do my research despite my institution, and that can't be the case anymore. We have to stop those sorts of things and establish our values and limits and cherish that power to act. And I think that's where I'm going to probably end, with suggesting that you draw yourself a donut. And thank you very much. So I'm in time, Gerhard. I don't know whether that left everybody exhausted, tired. It's a call to arms.
Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Thank you, Anne. I think, you know, what I find usually very interesting listening to these, specifically you talking about impact, is trying to take the same ideas and starting to measure it against different institutions and different universities and departments, and think how they would react to this at an individual level. I think it would also be quite interesting to ask the same question when you apply levels of criteria like what you highlighted to technical institutions, and how they would respond to that at the very least. Okay, but before we go on, I would like to open the floor to questions. Anyone on the floor would like to ask something? Yes.
Hello, Anne. This is Mia.
Hello, Mia.
Thank you very much for an inspiring speech. It was very motivating, very inspiring. So my question is regarding knowledge sharing among experienced practitioners. So I'm very thankful to be at a conference today. We are able to share our knowledge. We're able to listen to speeches like yours and a lot of other experienced researchers. But it made me think about designers who are still out there in the world trying to tackle all these problems. For example, regarding the circular economy. And my question to you is, do you think that design schools and universities should provide more continued education for designers to make sure that they can be updated throughout their entire careers?
Absolutely. I mean, there's two interesting things there. One, that if you're an architect, you have a duty of care to do so, and a professional duty of care to do so. So it's something that architects are required to do because they are a profession. Designers don't have, in that same sense, a professional body. But I think, and one of the challenges with design practice particularly is that design practice has been well known for many years to recruit fresh designers from universities all around the world, and that career development for designers generally is quite poor. And that's part of actually the culture of design practice, is that you all continue to learn together. And the other bit I would say about that is that there is an emergence around, and certainly not just in the UK, but more broadly in the world, around the idea of micro-credentials. I mean, I would challenge actually why anybody still thinks that, 3 years or 4 years as a degree and the tying of time and credits is a good idea. I've never worked that one out, and nobody has ever given me an answer other than that it's a business model that kind of works and we still do it. But actually, why does a degree take 3 or 4 years? It's some sort of average, and no student is average, and most of them have to work these days. So there are all sorts of questions around that. around, you know, whether we now have the wit and dare I say it, artificial intelligence to work out how to do an accretive degree in a very different way. So there are many things that could happen, and that would allow the professionals to move in and out of education as they need, and in response, in a responsive mode to whether it's a pandemic or whether it's changes in the cultures, circular economy, climate emergency, whatever it is. But we haven't cracked that. We still tie time and credit in ways that I think are pretty ancient now. They're 20th century, not 21st century. But no institution wants, or I say no institution, it's still a challenge. I'll leave it there. Thanks for the question, Mia.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes.
Hi, my name is Marty. I'm a doctoral student here at PolyU.
Hi.
Hi, so I'm going to ask you a question from the perspective of a doctoral student. I'm just curious, you know, if a doctoral student is within this institution and you know, like, what kind of advice would you give to doctoral students to address some of the issues that you brought up today? Especially regarding, you know, like pedagogical concerns and regarding, I don't know, maybe like redefining how impact works in relation to publish or perish, things like this. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And the first thing I'd say is don't fight all your battles at once. Get your PhD. It's the first thing. The first piece of advice I'd give. A PhD is a project like any other. Do it, and bank the questions. And part of that is you can't shift the system all the time. I suppose what I'm putting on the table is a context, and sharing that context rather than feeling that you're done to and a victim in a system is a really good place to start. If I was then giving you advice, I'd say one of the things to learn about, and Gerhard and I have spoken about this many times, is actually to understand the dynamics of impact. Really, because the stronger your evidence, the better the case you can make for grants, for anything else that you might be doing. So I would say there are some key, if you like, what you're asking me for is almost a critical path. In career terms. And one of the things I would say is learn how to teach and question the nature of teaching. That's a great thing, and you can do some of that in many places as part of your doctoral training. And you know, you're not an assistant in that context. You're actually learning what it is to get to transfer understanding between human beings. And the more you learn how to teach, the more you'll probably learn how to articulate your own field. So that's something you can do within a PhD. Get your PhD in time and don't treat it as the rest of your life, and understand the dynamics of impact, because that will give you the evidence base, not only to apply for your first or second grant, and none of those things are going to go away quickly. But keep an eye on quality rather than just getting the next paper out. And test that in any system. Really do understand that this is not just about writing up an experiment and publishing it somewhere and presenting it to a conference, but that the production is about the iteration and the kind of quality of what the message is or the research is. Well, I don't know if that's a very long answer probably to a short question, but
you're getting
it is about creating you a timeline that a critical path that gives you a career.
It's a thumbs up from this side, so you definitely addressed the question. Anyone else? Not so much a question, but from the online attendees, two comments actually. The one says, amazing, thanks Anne, and the second one said, how inspiring. And what is actually more interesting is the completion of the sentence saying, and sort of healing. which means that it actually dispels a lot of anxiety that people have when it comes to impact and research. And while I'm saying it, the audience is actually nodding at that, because I know, I see it with my colleagues, I see it when we talk to people in other institutions. You know, the criteria is not getting less, it's not being simplified, it's actually becoming more and more compounded. So, I mean, I actually have a question taking that forward, and that is, we see, or what you introduce in terms of the framework, is the replication of this impact model or framework across a variety of settings and institutions. Doesn't that by default become a little bit problematic if it's not maybe generated from, you know, using the criteria of a specific place itself? Does it make sense?
No, I'm not quite sure what you mean. I mean,
because you said, well, the REF framework, then you talk about the Hong Kong one, but then you said, well, Australia is now adopting a similar principle, they're using the same language. So the question is, why are we not seeing different languages coming out in places like Australia, for example, if they're talking about, you know, the whole stream of decolonizing certain streams of thinking, and that the modes of impact or the assessment on impact is not changing at the same time, it's actually going back to a similar model.
Well, I guess the question in there, or the interesting thing in there, is how you define different. How do you define the difference you make? And the reason I think there are, if you like, universal frameworks which actually put it on, and the reason I think impact becomes a kind of craft in and of itself beyond dissemination, which is to say, what does profound difference mean if you're in Australia, and what does profound difference mean in Hong Kong, and what does profound difference mean in the UK, depending on whether you're in the, you know, here, whether you're in the north or the south, you know, I mean, so even within that, but you can still ask the question, what's the evidence for the difference? And what we have to do, and I think the bit that we haven't done, and I can't speak about the ref in the UK at the moment because we're still doing it, so I can't divulge what we've seen. But one of the things I'd say was that we still haven't grasped, and this is our second go at it, we haven't really grasped all the methods for demonstrating that difference. And the point I made in the talk about you know, hearing the voices of users. So the most powerful thing you ever hear is when you hear a community saying, this has changed my life, or it saved my life in the case of some things. And that might be equally the case in Australia, but the language you're right, may be very different. But we've still got, it's my question as a researcher then is how we develop those methods for capturing that. And that can't be beyond the wit and ability of designers to do that. So we need to design, and my point about learning it early is, if our researchers and our students, and indeed our institutions and academics, start to find those methods, we will find the evidence to give and give value and indeed articulation to research, such that we actually do play in the space of research funding, to go back to a sort of government model. At the moment we struggle. Design always struggles to win money, or it wins money in popular areas. So you heard, I mean, Rachel runs an extraordinary research engine at Imagination, which she built, and she's been very successful, but the research is, if you like, on government message. If you are doing something which is more modest or different and is not a priority of government, then where do you get the money from? But actually the way to do that is to produce compelling evidence. And we've got to work through the methods, methodologies and structures that allow us to capture that, as well as to do the research and broadcast it, because nobody may read it or take any notice. So the evidence of impact is vital, absolutely vital, and the systems absolutely can change and should change depending. I mean, you know, if you took South Africa as another model, you'd want to make the language the right language for there. And that's not a problem, because actually we'll all recognize the evidence if you produce it. But the voices need to be there. Users, beneficiaries, audiences are all different things, and we have to capture that and treasure it and build enduring partnerships that are not about the transaction of what we want to do, but about the collective difference we make. Sorry, that's a bit of speech, wasn't it?
No, that's good. That's good. Then we have a question from an online participant. The ambition of design to make difference and be impactful cannot be accomplished by designers alone. To reach out and construct the network for impact, how do you see design research, for example, PhD programs, etc., how can they open the door to other research disciplines, to economists and to sociologists, or even bankers and CEOs?
Indeed, absolutely. So we need, that's the point of the art of collaboration, and that's why we shouldn't be bubbles in and of ourselves. So the research question, if you're asking a research question which is about for example, the economy, you probably need a supervisor, you probably need partnerships, academic partnerships, and indeed non-academic partnerships, potentially with bankers or whoever, to understand, one, the knowledge and the field of the discipline. So you may have a design supervisor, you may have an economist as a supervisor, and you may have somebody from a bank as a supervisor. But that means we've got an awful lot of work to do in those terms about how those things come together. I mean, I don't know about Hong Kong so much. I'm pretty sure in Australia, but certainly in the UK, we have something called the Collaborative Doctoral Award, which are very specific awards, and they are designed precisely to do that, to bring professional bodies, whether they're, I mean, in many cases they're museums or galleries or libraries, but they could be any subject, to the table, so that they are part of the co-supervisory team. And you know, Hong Kong PolyU would be very well set up to do that. It has extraordinary industry connections where you could actually work those things very closely together to bring different collaborative structures. But we then have another responsibility, which is to train those people to be good supervisors. But they will then understand better the kind of work we do. And one of our, I mean, I don't know about in Hong Kong so much, but certainly here, one of the things that universities, you know, aren't flavor of the month at the moment. And I think we could be better if we could explain what we do. And that's why impact is a really powerful tool to others, to other taxpayers who effectively give us, I mean, in the case of the REF in the UK, 1.6 billion a year, pounds. And that's a lot of money, taxpayers' money, and they want to see the difference we make. And that's a way of doing it. But we have to take on some of those responsibilities then. Back to Mia's question about how we train people to be good supervisors and good educators. And it's a question it's really to tomorrow's discussion around the circular economy, but I think education needs to look at the circular economy and how it practices it, as opposed to teaches it to others.
Perfect segue into my next question. You already mentioned this idea that impact and career development goes hand in hand, or it could have a stronger link, so to say. But how can you link the question of impact to curricula and education?
Well, one of the things that I think is often missed in developing impact is it doesn't have to be the researcher that makes the difference. The researcher does the research. And my point about the broader community is that I spend most of my life doing this, which is, you know, there is a sort of hierarchy that has tended to appear in universities, which is that if you're a researcher, you're an elite, and teaching is just one of those things that you do on the side. And actually, that's not the case. It's a bit like the COVID argument that says, you know, the highest paid people actually didn't know what to do with themselves during COVID. It was all the people that put ventilators, looked after us, cared for us, and delivered our food that were the key workers. So if we're all going to recognize key workers, teachers, and the craft of teaching is absolutely as critical as research and impact. And the reason that I think impact is important and indeed critical to higher education in its current form, and I hope future form, is that if we're all working towards the same goal, which is that we're actually going to make a difference in the world beyond the academy and not just support our own, as it were, then we need to think about how students, for example, may be agents of impact in doing a project in the civic community or in industry that takes the research into that context, so that then your teaching, research and impact have a different relationship. So your students and indeed your partners and indeed your professionals are your agents of impact. And that's how you look into you have a different relationship. It doesn't have to be, there's nothing in any rule anywhere that says because you did the research, you have to be the agent of impact. Anybody can be the agent of impact, but it means you've all got to have a conversation.
Great. There's an online question, and it reads, how to produce or generate impactful design research if design is not at all recognized as a research discipline at the national level. I am from Russia, and that is the current situation now. What would your advice be on this? PS, I publish only in English, as it is the only way to get published or to get my work properly published in journals.
Yeah, that's a real problem. And the English-speaking world is not very willing to learn other languages, or not willing enough, perhaps. And that's one set of things. But the key question in this may be actually to, I mean, I don't know the context of Russia, so I may be speaking wrongly here, but I think where you have done design research, that by focusing on the difference you can make by applying that design research wherever you do it, is about building the evidence base that you can then feed back into grants, or indeed take to a collaborative award and work with others, whether that's in AI or in health, well-being, climate change. But you can, by creating evidence, you have a body of evidence beyond research that says, this is how I make a difference, and this is what I can then contribute to the landscape. What design research is not good at doing outside itself quite often is to take the research it's done and explain the evidence for then saying, this is how we make a difference societally, and consequently, this is why we should be in your broader project. I mean, we always have to find routes, because all governments, and I don't, as I say, I don't know the Russian context at all, but actually all governments will fund research that's in the interests, what they see as the economic interests of the nation. And the reason we have a dual funding system in many countries, including the UK, is such that institutions fund some research from that part of that dual funding system, and we bid for research in the other part of that system. And we should be able to then do research that is less on government message, and some that is is independent. But I would say to you that by building impact, you build evidence, and evidence that you can then use as a as a currency, in a sense, to where and how you can join with others to connect research, would be the first step. And I don't know how easy that is in Russia. I can't comment. But actually, you could also do that internationally, particularly if you're publishing in English.
Right. Unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you very much for spending the time with us and instilling certain new values to the community. And then for everyone, Professor Anne Boddington, everyone, thank you very much.
Great to see you. Great to see you all, and thank you very much for having me.